Hello and welcome to Module 8 in our Django series. This module is going to focus on the Django Sessions framework. Just a brief introduction. As you may already be aware, HTTP is a stateless protocol. What does that mean? We know already that when a request goes from a client through their browser to the server generates a response and sends that back to the client browser. What's important to remember is that every request that comes from this same connection is not related to any request that goes before it or any request that comes after it. Each request is understood by the server in isolation of every other request that comes from the same connection. Also, each request contains enough information for the server to send a response without having to store anything on the server, right? This, in essence, is what statelessness means. However, when we create a web application, we need to have a mechanism that can be used to manage state between our site and the client browser. But what is state? Take the example of an e-commerce application where you have your shopping cart, you've added some items to that cart, you move away from that site for a little while. When you come back, you expect to see those items in your shopping cart, right? So that you don't need to start the entire process again. And the items in that shopping cart represent visible state that you as a user can see, right? But there's also invisible state. An example would be site preferences of each user that are stored on the server and then made available to the client browser or the user browser whenever the user reconnects to that site. Now, this state management mechanism is referred to as a session. And Django allows us to have different kinds of session. We could have a cookie-based session. We could have a database-backed session. We could also have a cache session or even a file-based session. We'll look at each of these separately, but now talking about Django sessions, Django provides complete support for anonymous sessions, thus allowing us to store and retrieve arbitrary data on a per-site visitor basis. By default, this data is stored on the server side and then made available when the user or the client reconnects to the site server. But how does a server know which session data pertains to which client browser? And that's where a session ID comes in. So a cookie is used to store a session ID on the client side. What is a cookie? Well, a cookie is just a small piece of information stored in the client browser. In this case, the information stored is a session ID, which of course, as I mentioned earlier, allows the server to send that session data back to the client browser. How are sessions implemented in Django? Sessions in Django are implemented through middleware, and you may have seen middleware settings in your settings.py file. The session middleware is already activated when we run our start project command. So we don't need to activate session middleware again, right? Important to note though that if you're not using sessions, then it pays to remove that line from your middleware settings so as to save some overhead. Now let's talk about configuring the sessions engine. And here we're going to discuss the different types of sessions. So for a database-backed session, we need to first of all add django.contrib.sessions to the installed apps setting in our settings.py file. Now this has already been done again when we ran a start project command, so we don't need to do that. Also for database-backed sessions, we need to run migrate to install the database table. There is one single database table that will store session data. But again, we've already run this migrate command when we created our models, and so we don't need to do that. Coming to cache sessions, Django recommends you use these sessions only if you have memcached or Redis cache as a backend. Now, memcached is an in-memory cache server, and Redis is an in-memory database that can be used for caching. Why does Django recommend that we use any one of these? Well, because the local memory cache backend does not retain data long enough, therefore it's not a good choice. Also, it is not multiprocess safe and therefore not recommended for the production environment. In fact, it would be faster to use file or database sessions directly instead of routing everything through the file or database cache backends. Right? Talking about file-based sessions now, and we need to set the session engine to django.contrib.sessions.backends.file. We can also specify the file path by using the session file path setting so that we can control where the data is stored. If we don't use the session file path setting, by default, Django will store the session data in the temp directory. Right? So normally on Windows, it would be on the C drive in the temp directory, that's temp, and in Linux, it would be /tmp. Now, it's important to ensure that the server can read and write to the file location if we are using the session file path setting. Now, talking about cookie-based sessions, in order to use this backend, we need to set the session engine to django.contrib.sessions.backends.sign cookies. Django then uses cryptographic signing tools and the secret key setting to store the session data. But what's cryptographic signing? Essentially, values are signed so that they can be passed safely through untrusted channels because tampering can easily be detected. Django provides a low-level API for signing these values. Django also has a high-level API for setting and reading these signed cookies. We also need to ensure that the session cookie HTTP only setting stays at the default, which is true. This is to ensure that JavaScript cannot access the stored session data. Now, the size of a cookie can impact site speed. The common limit for the size of a cookie is 4096 bytes. Django, though, will not raise an exception if the size of a cookie exceeds 4096 bytes. It's very important to remember that sessions are not invalidated when the user logs out, unlike other backends. So an attacker can therefore steal a user cookie, use it to log in as a user, even after the user has logged out. Now let's talk about Django sessions and views. Every HTTP request object has a session attribute, and we can read from as well as write to this attribute at any point in the view. So now let's go ahead and modify the project so as to display the number of site visits made by each user. We're going to start with a database backed session. So come to your command prompt, change directly to your virtual environment, activate the environment, start VS Code, and come to your views.py file. We need to modify the index view. Here we'll put in a variable, number of visits equal to request dot session. We are accessing the session attribute, and the session attribute is a dictionary like object. So we say get here, and we can specify the key, that is number of visits, and the initial value will be 1. Right? Now, of course, after the first visit, we've got to increase the value by 1. So here we'll say request dot session, and that will be number of visits equal to number of visits plus 1. And then we've got to send number of visits as context, right? So here, put in the dictionary, the key will be number of visits, and the value will be number of visits. Right? Now we need to go to our index.html file, that is the template. And just after this line, we say, put in the variable that's coming through the context, that's number of visits. Now we specify time. Now for the first time, it will appear as you have visited the site 1 time. But after the first time, this should change to times, right? So to take care of that, we specify number of visits, and we use the pipe pluralize. right? So this will ensure that this appears as times if the user visits the site more than once. So that's all. So now we've got to run our server. For that, change directory to the container folder and then run the server. Go to the browser, navigate to the home page. And you can see this appears as you have visited the site one time. Refresh the page and that should change to 2. Right? You can see how that works. Right click on your screen and click Inspect and click on Application, and there you can see the session ID. Right? You can also see we have an error. To access that error, click on Console, and we're going to ignore this for now. We'll deal with it later. We will deal with this one today. But coming back to the Application tab, click on the session ID and then copy it, Control C, and now come back to the command prompt, stop the server, Control C, and go to the shell. So py manage.py shell, type in from django.contrib.sessions.models import session. So you see Django uses a session model to create that database table, right? Now once we've done that, we can say s equal to session.objects.get, and we can use primary key since it is a model, equal to, and then paste that session ID there. So now you can actually take a look at the dictionary. s.get decoded will show you the dictionary. Now why do we need to use get decoded? Because this is stored in an encoded format. You can also see the expiry date of the session. So s.expire date will give you that date, right? So you can see that's the year, the month, the day, and then of course the time, right? And you can change that. We will set it to 5 minutes. So go back to your code and in your views.py file, we can say here request.session.set expiry 300. Okay, so that's 5 minutes. Okay, so after 5 minutes, the session will expire. Right, so now let's take care of the error we saw earlier. This one. For that, we need to come to our base.html file. So come to base.html. Now here, we need to put in document.add event listener. And the event is DOM, that's document object model, content loaded. Right, so this indicates that this will be run, or the callback will be run only after the entire document object model content is loaded. Right, that should take care of that error. Okay, so now make sure that the server is running, which it is not, so we need to exit the shell and then run the server. Go to the browser. Let's close this for now. Refresh the page. So that increases to 3. Right click and inspect. And that's only that one error. Right, it's not really going to cause us any issues for now, so we're going to leave it. Now let's move on to file-based sessions. For file-based sessions, come to your settings.py file Now, since we are in the settings.py file, you can see that in these middleware settings, you have session middleware there activated, right? We also have django.contrib.sessions, which enables us to use the database backed sessions. For the file backed sessions, you need to set session engine equal to django.contrib.sessions.backends.file. Okay. We can also specify the path to the file. So session file path equal to, and we're going to put in there /session data. Now we need to, of course, create this folder on the C drive. So come to the C drive, right click, new folder, and let's call that session data. So now go back to the browser and you can actually reset this to 1. How? Through the settings by deleting the browser history, right? Or if you just refresh that, okay, so there's an issue here. Our server is not running because we made some changes in our settings.py file. Run the server again. Refresh the page. And you can see because we're using file-based sessions now, this has reset to 1. Right? Now, if you go to your Windows Explorer and you look at the folder that you created, this one, you can see there's a file there. And of course, within that would be stored the data. So that's about file-based sessions. Now let's move on to cookie-based sessions. For cookie-based sessions, first of all, we'll need to change this. So you can comment this out and then put in session engine equal to django.contrib.sessions.backends.signed cookies, right? And now come to the views.py file. We need to modify the code. So here we'll say number of visits equal to, we'll cast the cookie because the cookie, remember, is always a string. So we'll cast it to integer request dot cookies dot get, and that's going to be number of visits, comma 1, right? Then we check if last visit in request dot cookies, right? So last visit is a cookie that we're going to set shortly. If it is present, then last visit equal to request dot cookies, and we get the information and store it in that variable. Okay. Now we can also save the time. So we'll say last visit time equal to date time dot date time dot strp time. So that's the Python strp time, and that will be last visit slice -7, and then the format will be, okay. Once we've got that, now we check if date time dot date time dot now minus last visit time, right, dot seconds. So if the seconds are greater than 5, or you can make it 10 if you like, then we add 1 to the number of visits. So number of visits plus equal to 1, right? So the number of visits will be increased every 5 seconds. And then we have a flag, last visited, which we will set to true. Else, which means that the user hasn't visited more than once, right? Therefore, last visit is not in request.cookies. We still have to set last visit to true. Right? Why we will see shortly. Now we create the response variable that we will return. Response equal to render request, comma, name of the app, / template name, and the context. Right? So that's number of visits as key. And the value will come from number of visits. Right? We check if last visited, that flag is true, then we set the cookies. So here response dot set cookie, and that will be last visit, comma, date time dot now. So now you know why we are still setting it to true, because even if the user has visited once, we've got to save that time, right? And another cookie, response dot set cookie, and that will be number of visits and the value will come from number of visits. Okay. And then don't forget we've got to return response. Now this code can be commented out, and this line as well. Now check that the server is running. Run the server. Go to the browser. Refresh the page. Okay, so we have an error here. Last visited reference before assignment. Let's go and check that. So here we have said last visit instead of visited. Right? Go back. Refresh. And again, you can see that's reset to 1. Right click, inspect, go to application, and there you have the cookies. Okay, so I hope that's clear. The last thing we need to do is to put in an icon there so that this looks nicer, right? For that, there is a .ico file that you will find at the link in the description of this video. Download that file and then save it in your app / static / images folder, right? So I hope you know how to go there. Username, and then our virtual environment name, And then our project, our app, static, app, images, and then Control V to paste. Okay, so that's the file. Once you've done that, then come to your base.html file. And up here, we'll put in a link tag, or you can even put it below this one. So link, this will be an icon, href equal to, and that will be static app name / images / the name of the file. Right? Type will be image. Don't forget to close the tag. Now go back to the browser. Of course, make sure that server is running, and then go back to the browser and refresh the page. Okay, so what do we have here? Let's go back to the view. Here is the error. This should be a hyphen. Right, and now you shouldn't have an error there. Stop the server. Start it again. Go back, refresh the page. Right? And now, of course, you can see that icon there. This ends our session for today. In the next session, we'll discuss authentication. Till then, take care. Bye.